Hi, thanks everyone for coming. My first little card here says intro, breathe. Find these things slightly nerve-wracking, but I feel like this is a somewhat less terrifying environment than the talk I had to give about my research as part of my PhD, which I'm doing at the moment. That was terrifying. So this feels friendlier. I feel a much friendlier audience, including the dog. I'm going to talk about my practice in general and talk about some influences, some film influences, and talk about some projects that I did not far from here when I was studying at the Royal College, and some important projects that sent me off on a particular kind of trajectory. And I'm going to talk about a kind of thread that runs through those and how that runs through to what I'm doing at the moment. I always find when you're planning one of these talks that it's interesting actually looking back at the things that you've done over a while and seeing those things with hindsight and seeing the connections that you make. I'm going to talk a bit about LARP, which stands for Live Action Roleplay, which is a form that I work with and I'm kind of pretty obsessed with and I'm always quacking on about, and I'll talk a bit about that. And then I'll talk about sort of my work since I started working with LARP about 4 or 5 years ago and how that's influenced my practice and made me think in different ways about how I work with people, how I work with film, and how I might make sculpture, and how I work possibly within an education context. So I'll talk... I didn't say that, did I? Live action role play. LARP. LARP, yeah. It's not used much or known much really in this country, to be honest. Your familiarity with it might be people dressed up in orc and goblin costumes running around woods on a weekend. And that's like cool, you know, they do that thing. And I'll talk more about that in a bit. But I thought I'd start by just like laying down a sort of slightly depressing tone. But I wanted to show some films. They're not depressing, but they're quite. Just a little clip from 3 films that have really influenced my thinking. I think probably I'm inspired more by films than I am other artists in some ways. So this first film is this is a little bit from a film called Bad Boy Bubby, which is an Australian film. It's about a man who's trapped in a room and with his mum. He's never met his dad, and he's lived in there all his life. He's about 40, and it starts very bleak, but eventually he leaves this room after murdering his mum by wrapping her in cling film. And then he goes out into the wide world, and the film is about how he experiences the world for the first time in a series of pretty crazy scenes, each of which is directed by a different director of photography, so they're all styled very differently. He's wearing a gas mask because his mum's told him that if he leaves the room he lives in, he'll be poisoned by the poisonous gas, which of course isn't true. So once he's killed his mum, he ventures out in a gas mask to see what the real world is like for the first time, and this is that moment. So it doesn't start very well for poor Bubby. And this is another film called Altered States by Ken Russell. I think it's by Ken Russell, maybe it's not by Ken Russell actually. It's about a scientist who's trying to, get back to his kind of prehistoric self, or the prehistoric genes, which he believes are like locked in your DNA. And he thinks you can access this through isolation tanks and LSD. And the imagery is boggling. This is like one of his amazing hallucinations that he has when he's on peyote. They're kind of naff in a way, but also fantastic. I'm really into like the way we depict mad people, outsiders, cavemen, prehistoric man. Altered States. And that leads nicely into this film, which is called A Quest for Fire. This is relatively recent, actually, like discovery for me at least anyway, and it's a film about Cro-Magnon man and the evolution of one tribe who have discovered fire, but they don't know how to light fire. They just know how to keep it going. If their fire goes out, everything goes tits up. And in the film, very early on, their fire goes out. And they send out a few men from the tribe to try and reignite their fire to keep them going as they need it. And this is the moment where he's found by another tribe who are more evolved. They know how to start fires, and they're weighing him up as whether or not he would be good fodder to feed to the wives of the tribe to like diversify their, their DNA essentially. But this idea of like different groups meeting one another, not speaking the same language, being at different kind of evolutionary stages is something I find it interesting, and I kind of play around with these ideas a lot of different groups meeting one another who might not speak the same language, often playing with this idea of the kind of caveman a bit. So those films are all good. You should watch all of those. They're very good. Okay, cool. Okay, so look, little overview. It's a bit washed out. So bit of an intro, some things that generally I've been looking at in previous works. People, as I said, I'm very interested in people and how we relate to one another, particularly people or groups or cultures that in some way are excluded or might sit on the edges. A sculpture is something, for me, like sculpture tends to be, I think of it more as a prop or something that makes me do something or I can use to achieve a certain state rather than things that I make that are put on a sort of plinth. But nonetheless, I'll talk about a bit of sculpture. I'll talk about my films a touch. I'll give the light bulb moment where I discovered LARP. And then I'll go on to talk about how it kind of happened post-LARP. So I wanted to start maybe by giving like just a little tiny underpinning of where that interest comes from in talking about like outsiders or being interested in that. So these are some pictures of my dad. I never met my dad, sadly. And when I was in my 30s, I found out they took his own life, which is tragic. Shortly after that, I came by these photos through a family that I didn't actually know I had at the time, and suddenly I had this huge family, aunties and uncles and all the rest of it, and out of that came these pictures. Now, I'd grown up at that point knowing that my dad was a drug addict, a schizophrenic, he was an alcoholic, and I generally grew up as a child thinking he was a bit of a monster. So I had this kind of relationship to this man that I was never going to meet, and I was terrified of him. So I kind of thought in myself in some way that lying within me there's this like terrible monster waiting to come out. And he took his own life, and it was very sad because I realised I'd never then meet him. But I got these pictures and I met all this extended family, and it turned out that actually, whilst those things were true, and he did have this illness and he did have a tragic end to his life, Hugh was his name. His nickname for the rest of the family was Hug, and he was just this lovely gentle giant. And there was this moment where I suddenly changed my way that I thought about this man who up until that point was a kind of monster. At that time and around that time, I was making performances where I was dressing up as people that I was like poaching off the streets, and they tended to be odd people, like down and outs, and I was dressing up as them and making performances. I thought maybe I should make a performance of me as my dad, like maybe he's like the greatest outsider or something. That felt wrong. So instead, I kind of cast myself literally as a statue of him. I tracked down a suit that was a bit like the suit that you saw in that previous picture, which is him at his second wedding. And I made myself a statue of this man asleep in a corner. Like on a slightly lighter note, like this was in a show in North London, and on one of the days of the exhibition, the gallery staff came in and they thought that someone had broke into the gallery and died, which seems ridiculous because it's obviously a statue. But nonetheless, they phoned the police. The police turned up like armed, ready to apprehend this like crackhead or whatever, and they're like, no, it's a mannequin, it's the sculpture. Anyway, so in a way that felt like I could sort of move on from making work in that vein a little bit, like that chapter had closed and it felt important. But around that time I was dressing up a lot and looking at like how slight a mask might need to be to enable you to become someone else. And so I was travelling around London with a suitcase with false noses and costumes, and I would go to public toilets. Is it going to change slide? It might hang a little bit. Oh, here we go. I'd go into public toilets and change into like a character, a bit like a kind of anti-Superman or something, and then come out and just go for a walk down the road and try to just sort of be as these slightly odd, not totally crazy people, but with these funny noses. And then I had photographers with long zoom lenses hidden who would capture. I thought they would capture all these like shock, horror reaction. There's a strange guy down the road, and no one cared, no one batted an eyelid, and it was all around London and Kensington. And in a way that said more to me about how we relate to the outsider than people kind of reacting. There we go, naked man. I'm just going to jump forward a couple of slides. But I felt that, I started to feel a bit parasitic or something, like it wasn't particularly generous of me, like I was, or some people said that, like maybe I was kind of pointing the finger or taking the mick out of these people that were like downtrodden in some way. And that, well, it's not the case, and it wasn't the case. But I felt like in order to talk about that sort of phenomenon in a new way, I needed to kind of create my own new cast of people, my own sort of tribe, if you like. So I kind of gave birth to these like people called the Mudheads. That's what they became known as. And I wanted to start with their life with a kind of a sort of ritualized kind of, I imagined it as a sort of like moving cave painting or something. And I also liked the idea that in the very beginning, this might be like a sort of depiction of their like creation myth or something, but they were featureless. And in the video, this is like a triptych. So there's we see a wide like this, and then we see a shot of their feet, and we see a close-up of their torsos, and they just walk endlessly in these circles. What I wanted to do, the idea, was to sort of follow this fictional people's like evolution and see how they moved from very little to start to develop more complex language and rituals, and all the while kind of thinking about how I could use them as a tool to think about relating to the other, you know, in a very sort of long-winded, roundabout way. So this is me at the top of the rubbish dump. This is slightly inspired by a film called Street Trash, which is this film about tramps that drink contaminated booze and melt in a pile of goo, which I was going to show on the slides, but I thought pre-watershed might not be too good. Anyway, this is me, and this was a video work. A lot of the things I'm showing you are stills from the shoots that was for the video, and in the end, actually, the video now isn't as good as the stills are. Actually, I think the stills kind of work better, and probably now as well, in retrospect, these things would have been better as performances. But maybe I was not ready to do stuff in front of an audience. But a lot of these things happened, and there was just a camera. And these guys and girls you can see at the bottom are all slightly inspired by people from around Camberwell and Peckham, a little bit. And they kind of became these very like cartoon-like characters, and the video was them doing a circular dance around this mound. So that then led to, that was the booger dance, that led to the Mudhead dance. Now the Mudheads are, they're kind of inspired by a real thing, which is the Mudhead clans of Pueblo, India, and New South Mexico. Hopefully this will exit in a moment. Yeah, here we go. So I think I was kind of looking for like parallels to my interest in like the fool or the idiot or the outsider or the clown or something. And in Pueblo society, not so much now, but maybe for tourists, but back in the day, they would have these seasonal like rain dances. And during this kind of very important dance, the Mudhead clowns would turn up unannounced, and they would upstage this important ritual. And they would turn up dressed in like sort of weird Westerner clothes, and they'd turn up and they'd throw poo and wee at the audience. And they were kind of venerated as these holy idiots. And you weren't allowed to look them in the eye, you weren't allowed to stop them doing what they were doing. And it was seen as an important role within their culture that you had someone who kind of did the thing that everyone wanted to do, but you weren't allowed to do. A bit like a comic, perhaps, now in our culture. You know, they say the thing that perhaps you don't want to say. So I was playing around with that idea. I'm just going to show you a little clip of something from the middle of the shoot, which, again, now, I think the shot on my iPhone is better than the thing that we shot on all this expensive camera gear. But this is just a little moment in the mid-rehearsal. I think we've got some people in the audience that may have been amongst this. So like what you can see broadly, though, is these naked guys over here are, they're kind of like the voyeur. And through a series of 3 kind of worlds, the voyeurs increasingly become more and more sort of risque, and they kind of eventually upstage this slightly choreographed dance. The dancers have made a choreography which has been based on appropriated gesture, so gestures and movements and actions that the dancers had gone out and poached or stolen from people in and around South London. So we made a series of characters that are based on the way someone might cross a road, or the way someone might pick their nose, or the way someone might in some way stand out. Where are we now? Okay, fine. We'll go back to that. I did have all these massive videos in the PowerPoint, but my PowerPoint was like how many terawatts of like teraflops. It couldn't handle it. So I'm going to jump out occasionally. Okay, so this is another still from that. At the time I was really lucky. I had a studio at the Biscuit Factory, which in Bermondsey, sadly it's not there anymore, but it had a 25,000 square foot cavernous hall with 10-metre high ceilings, and you could just use it for free if you wanted. So I really took the opportunity to just build big sets and make this kind of performance happen. So in a way, these voyeurs were kind of playing as me. They were kind of like, yeah, my role as the kind of voyeur studying these other people, and I kind of exploded them out and made a cast of characters as them. So what's important though about this project is that the audience turned up and they just didn't know what the fuck was going on, basically. And the idea was that it was a film shoot and also a sort of performance at the same time. I couldn't make my mind up, but I thought the audience can come along and they can see this film being made as a kind of performance. And the stage sets were, you could enter into them and you could look out from the stage sets into the kind of action being shot. I was really like always trying to bring the audience closer to the idea or the experience or the performers, and trying to like shorten that distance always. And it wasn't working, it didn't feel like it worked. And what was happening though is that the experience that I kind of wanted, or that was most interesting, was going on in the kind of minds and bodies of the performers, I felt. That's probably because we'd spent, I don't know, weeks together in studios doing workshops and rehearsals and making characters and fleshing out the world, and it was like a big journey that we all went on together. And I thought, that's interesting. That's much more interesting to me than an audience rocking up, not really getting something, and then leaving again. And so that seed was kind of planted. The Mudheads kind of continued to like have further descendants and reappear in other works. This was a work called Gobble, Gobble, Gulp, which was inspired by a homeless guy who was singing Amazing Grace outside Whitechapel Tube Station, and a man I'd seen in A&E the day before who had big swollen hands and elephantitis of his feet, and he couldn't drink. And they kind of conflated, and I kind of merged them with the Mudheads and made this sort of strip dance performance where the idea was to get drunk, but in order to get drunk you had to take your clothes off, but to take your clothes off was you were hindered because you had these big hands. But if you managed to get dressed and undressed enough times and drank all your drinks, you were rewarded A, by being drunk, and B, you got to sing Amazing Grace, and that was kind of like the prize, if you like. So that was, now looking back, it seems like this is the Mudheads and they've discovered alcohol, and it, you know, everything goes kind of a bit wrong for them. Anyway, an idea had been planted, and that was this idea of working with, trying to shorten the distance in some way. I was becoming more and more interested in not working with dancers and performers, and more interested in just working with people like me a bit, I think. I wanted to mix these groups together. So generally, if you're working with dancers from Laban, they're all beautiful and lithe and young and good looking, and I wanted to come with people that might have a pot belly, you know, just a bit older. And I thought, I know, I'm going to go and meet loads of LARPers. They'll be great. I'll recruit LARPers and make them perform for me. I'm not saying that all LARPers have pot bellies, but my awareness of LARP at that time was that it was normal people who in their spare time wanted to sort of tell stories, and it might mean that I had a broader, more interesting group of people to work with. So LARP in big letters. I got a grant, I went to Norway, it was wonderful. I went to this thing called Knutpunkt, which is a Nordic LARP convention that runs every year. It's been running for 25 years now, and it rotates between Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark. I think that's it. I went to Norway. I went thinking that I would just cream off the cool LARPers and bring them back and make them do performances, but I think the opposite kind of happened. They sort of recruited me a bit, and I had this moment where I just realised that I wanted to make LARPs, and I didn't want to make performances in the way I'd done before. I loved everything that I was learning, and Knutpunkt is like a sort of conference, 3 or 4 days, 500 people turn up. There's people from philosophy, teaching, education, arts, science, all who have an interest in telling stories and making people kind of come together in some way with a sort of structure of a role play game. And there were lots of really amazing methods that they developed outside of the art sphere, without all of that baggage of art history or whatever. They'd come up with some really amazing methods for making people do things that they might not ordinarily want to do because they might feel embarrassed. They'd have, and I thought, wow, okay, I need to take some of this back. I need to use some of this. So this is an amazing LARPer called Nina Runa Essendrop, who I'm actually bringing over for a show that I'm doing in the summer, or just at the start of the summer, to run some of her LARPs. She's an amazing LARPer. One of the things that I, having showed you this picture, this is what you generally might think a LARP is. Fantasy, ridiculous costumes, really over the top. I met Nina at the LARP Writer Summer School in Lithuania, where I went to learn to be a games master. It was the coolest thing. I was out there for like 5 days, and in a wood, in a former Russian Soviet factory workers holiday camp. It was just like bonkers, with about 100 people, 50 of whom were LARPers or wanted to be better LARPers, and 50 of whom were experienced LARPers who were teaching the way. It's sadly closed now, but it was funded by the Norwegian government, who in a roundabout way were trying to get Belarusians to integrate with the rest of Europe. And the way they did that is they set up a school and they gave Belarusians free tickets, because they'd been kicked out of Belarus prior to the Norwegian LARPers because they were radicalising teenagers. So that's a bit of context. Nina was making LARPs with no talking anyway. So they were silent. It was more like a kind of choreographic game, a dance-based thing. It struck me that these things worked as a performance. I'm not saying that you need an audience, but I felt like, wow, this is beautiful to watch, you know, as well as be in. So I'm a researcher, as I say, doing a PhD in Kent. I'm like sort of a bit in, a year and a half in, and you can tell I'm a researcher. Look at this, highbrow. But this is just, lots of people involved in LARP have a different idea of what it is or what it might constitute. And I was just asking people, like, what is it to you? Like, what would a pie, if a LARP pie was made, what would it constitute? And I can see these things being present. People cry, I've cried in LARPs. There's a lot of passion, there's a lot of understanding. Someone else, of course, expanded the pie, chopped it up and said, no, there's much more to the pie than those things. This is what a LARP comprises of, these things: storytelling, co-creating, courage, strong emotions, world design, learn by doing, develop and evolve, imagination. I mean, all of these things to me were like, I'm trying to use these methods myself in the worlds that I'm creating and the performances I'm trying to make. And you guys are doing it as well. So I felt like these things needed to mix. So now we're going to just show you a boggling slide to take in briefly. This is the history, or the kind of what's led to LARP as we currently know now. Some of you might recognize some of these. So we've got J.L. Moreno in the 1920s as a pioneering psychodramatist. He came up with the idea that, like, rather than sitting around and talking, we would stand up and pretend to be the roles, and then we'd sort of do therapy through doing. We've got Kurt Lewin's sensitivity training, military role play. So there was, where is it? RAND Group, where are they? They're somewhere. Oh, RAND Corp. They still run. They're an American organization that in the 50s were doing role play exercises where they would role play Cold War missile strike fallouts as a way to inform what we should do in the event of that happening. And they developed board games out of that. People left and went on to become games developers. And all of these things kind of were happening at the same time, and bits from all of them started to feed into LARP. One of the most important things that happened in England, which is perhaps really where it started in the form that we know now, is in the 80s, Dungeons and Dragons, which some of you might have heard about, was massive in America. They were playing on like E.T. in England, people were playing Dungeons and Dragons, and some bright spark thought, why don't we, rather than roll dice, why don't we just get up and like have rubber swords and run around and like pretend that I'm a dwarf, rather than roll a dice and say, your dwarf hit me, whatever. They did that, it grew, it ended up being on TV, and it became quite popularized. And that also happened in Sweden and Finland and blah, 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 blah. That's kind of how it's come to where it is now. And now, perhaps what's not in here is that there is now a lot of interest from artists coming in. I mean, I'm interested and involved with it, but Ed Forniellis is kind of working with it. John Raffman has been looking at and working within it. Brody Condon's another artist. He's also looking at using LARP. Brody Condon's did a LARP in Glasgow where they LARPed in a morgue, and they had dead bodies in the LARP, and the people played as dead bodies next to actual dead bodies, which is boggling, but they did that. So, a few more like things with lots of words on. This is a really interesting design kit that I learned when I was at the LARP school. So this is like, I don't know whether it's legible to be honest, but this is a kind of crossfader of the different things that you might, look at this, hang on, I've always wanted to do this, wait. Yes, I've got my cat laser. So, Games Master style. Is the Games Master very active or is it very passive? A very active Games Master would be, so Games Master is the person that runs the LARP. An active Games Master would be in with the players, perhaps even physically manipulating them, like compressing their chest if they're supposed to be shocked. Whereas a very passive Games Master might set the LARP up and then just sit back and watch the whole thing unfold. Communication style, is it verbal or is it physical? And so you could use this as a kind of way to communicate what type of LARP it is to the players and also as a design tool. Again, stuff that's so handy and useful if you're thinking about making a performance and how do we engage with an audience, or what kind of experience do I want to kind of create. So what is LARP? Yeah, it's LARP design, it's world design. It's designing characters, it's thinking about the relationships the characters have to one another. It's thinking about and designing the setting. And I have to admit that these slides, these next few, I've stolen, should I say. I took photos of them at Knutpunkt and they're very low res, so I've made my own ones based on them. So if anyone from the LARP police is present, that's where they're from. I don't take full credit for them. But yeah, so relationships, setting, designing of culture, the different mechanics that we need to think about designing, simulation mechanics. One example might be a mechanic which is called Ars Amandi, which is where you might want to simulate sex or like love, physical contact. And it's not necessarily always a good idea to have loads of dildos and people dry humping each other in a LARP. So what they came up with is a mechanism where you would treat from the elbow down to your fingertips as being erotic or erogenous. So two people could pretend to make love with one another in the presence of others just by playing around with fingers and doing things like this. That might be one mechanic that is designed and then everybody uses this and we know that this means this in this LARP. So those are the other elements. But one really important thing that comes out of LARP design is this question they always ask, like, yeah, but what are you actually going to be doing in your LARP? And it's a really like fundamental question. And I always think that now when I go and see like a kind of relational art piece or a performance or a participatory art piece or an immersive theatre piece, like what am I supposed to be actually doing other than just being me and just kind of passively watching? Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I feel like maybe we can do more. So, okay, we're doing okay for time. I'm all right. This is post Knutpunkt, post like I've come back, I'm going to make a LARP. I wanted to make a LARP about bullying. It wasn't the best LARP ever, but I think there's something there that could be refined. But I made a LARP about bullying, and I wanted to look at how you might separate language or the voice from the body. So the basic story for this LARP is it was a sort of kitchen sink drama, a depiction of three siblings, Alex, Charlie, and Robin. It's a unisex name, so it can be played by boys or girls. Not that it really matters, people play either gender, but anyway. And they were in a slightly depressing household. Their dad was an alcoholic, and mum wasn't around. And the LARP is about these guys trying to kind of get through like a term at school and going to and fro from their house. And what we did in the LARP is we had 3 people play each of the characters. So one of those people played the voice, and the other 2 people played the physical sense of them. what they didn't do was mime what was being said, but they tried to kind of sculpt imbalances or power imbalances or status between one another. And the three speaking characters would be on the outside of the space, and they would tell a story effectively, sort of narrate this story. And there was an audience, which is a thing that's also sort of a bit frowned upon in LARP. And if I didn't make that clear, maybe I didn't make it clear, but the thinking behind an audience sort of being bad in a LARP is that they aren't actors doing what they're doing. They're not professional performers often. And it takes quite a lot to kind of create a trusting environment where people feel happy to do silly stuff. And that's quite a fragile thing. We kind of sign this social contract. And as soon as someone comes in who's not part of that, generally people clam up or feel a bit embarrassed. And that same is true of a camera often. So if there is a camera present in a LARP, it tends to need to be rationalized as being part of the fiction, like there's a photographer in the story, so we can have one. So people often go to quite extreme lengths to find ways to document them without kind of breaking the spell or the magic circle. So sticking them in the middle of a room with a circle of audience around them would be like what you don't do. It kind of worked, and I don't know. What you see here is a debrief. This is, again, I think this is really valuable. This is the importance and the weight they give on the conversation we have after the event. Like, what do we do with the knowledge that's gained through doing this thing that we don't ordinarily do? Like, what do I gain from playing a bully for an hour and a half and then talking about that? What have I kind of embodied and absorbed? So they give they have this structured thing called a runda, a debrief, which is just as simple as we sit in a circle. But as we sit in a circle and everybody gets to say something uninterrupted, they can talk positively or negatively about their experience, the design of the LARP, the mechanics in place. And debriefs can be very long or quite short. And I've come to think, and a few other people have come to think that I know who've been doing it for a long time, that a LARP is really just an excuse to have a more informed conversation at the end. Really, this is what we're trying to get to, is this chat in a way that we might not ordinarily be able to have, which I think is really interesting. And again, something that I feel is missing sometimes when I encounter other types of similar artworks. I kind of want to have an opportunity to really talk about what happened other than just with my girlfriend on the bus on the way home. Maybe not, I don't know. Breath, okay. Where are we? This is slide number there. I'm just going to make sure I don't lose myself. So being the sort of, I don't know, dickhead I sort of am or whatever, the fact that people said you couldn't have an audience made me think, rubbish, I'm just going to make LARPs with audiences all the time and I'm going to just prove you all wrong. And I kept having the same problems, which I've explained, is that it just would sort of fall apart. So that led me to start thinking about how I could design a type of LARP that would accommodate an audience and people wouldn't be embarrassed. So that's kind of at the back of my mind at this point. What you can see now is a picture of us, a mix of people on the way out to Sherwood Forest. This was a project called, it was part of a project called the Sherwood Open Forest a couple of years ago. I proposed that we would go to a wood and make a new religion or a new belief system using role play. And they said, sure, here's loads of money, go to the woods. And we went and we lived in bracken shelters for like a week, kind of like sort of surviving, although there was a pizza oven. It wasn't really like surviving, but it felt like a bit. We've got dancers, poets, musicians, a LARPer, choreographer, a writer, stage director, a printmaker, a builder, and his baby. He came. I still can't believe he brought his baby. He did. He's like, yeah, we'll love it. And we went out there and we lived in these kind of makeshift Of course, the builder brought a tarp, and his was the only shelter that didn't leak terribly. The rest of us all had bivvy bags. So we were waterproof, but we were floating in these like kind of little weird enclosures that we'd made. And we were there for 8 days. And in those 8 days, we tried to have lots of levels of role play going on. One example would be that every day we'd wake up, we'd write down what our dreams were, and we would use material from the dreams to kind of create characters that we would then play in role plays that day. And then they would sort of feed back into the dreams on some level. We did a lot of stuff with moving around with our eyes closed and giving birth to weird totem animals and then trying to be that totem animal later on. And some of those totem animals got sculpted and made into these really elaborate masks, which were used in a performance back at the Jerwood. People were murdered, ritually sacrificed, of course. It wouldn't be a LARP if people didn't die. This is Hamish McPherson, who is a dancer and a choreographer and a fantastic artist in his own right, who sadly can't be here, who I work with a lot now. I'll talk about him a bit more. This was like an impossibly hilarious LARP where we had this one interesting mound in the wood which we wanted to explore at different points in time, in the past, in the present, and in the future. And when we decided to explore it in the future as a role play, we used this free word association. We played the idea that there'd be a totally new language, which if you've ever done or you've never done is, so rather than use normal words, you would just use other words to mean other things. So this was like, there was a really upsetting moment where someone had died, but people were called mangoes, and it's one of those things we kind of had to be there. But anyway, like, it looks like something serious is going on, but we're like in stitches on the floor trying to piece together some semblance of order. Out of our time in the woods, we made a new language, and we played this really simple game, which was just an exercise to kind of free up our tongues. And the exercise was take everything out of our pockets and put them on the table. We're at a table in the woods, and we're not going to speak in English for the process of this, and we can't rationalize what we're doing in English, and we can't talk about the exercise outside of the exercise. But what we're going to do is we're going to name the things with new words, new sounds, and then a logic grew out of that, starting up with naming like this as a flobbity blob or a black splob or a plonk or whatever. And it became very complicated, and it became this quite complex language that we then tried to use for the most of the week that we were there. And this was this like tea leaf stained piece of paper to make it look like it's an old thing that you did as a kid. Some of these animals, these totem animals, became masks. Once we'd come back from the woods, I had to kind of translate that experience of being in the woods for 8 days into some sort of performance or something in the gallery. Someone in the gallery, someone here, who I won't laser point, is this person here. And these characters were all created through blindfold exercises where they made these animals. And the sort of performance that we did is we tried to communicate this group of people who, again, I sort of saw as descendants of, in some way, of the Mudheads or something. They were trying to communicate something lost, something forgotten about the forest to the city. And they tried to do so without talking. And that meant telling kind of physical, sculptural stories. And what you see on the back of the wall is us kind of filling up the walls with this kind of archive of our language, which continued to evolve throughout the show. Okay, Shabba, where are we? Cool, okay. I'll show a little clip. I felt very happy when the Arts Council said they would give me some money to make what I thought was a LARP, and kind of is. I thought, like, I've cracked it, that's it, like I've been legitimised. They're gonna, you know, because in Norway, and the places where LARP is common, the arts funding never goes to the LARPers. They long ago sort of saw it not being art. Whereas here, I was like, no one knows. I can be like, I'm not saying that it shouldn't be. I think it should be. But anyway, it felt good to do that. So I'm going to show a bit of this work. This was a piece that we made in with Legion TV Gallery, and it was in Wick Woodlands in Hackney Marshes. The story is that a group of people that don't speak with words, they speak with objects from a strange culture we don't know. They've moved into the local woodland and they've set up there, and they want to integrate into London, but and they've invited some community groups from the neighbourhood to come out and to see if they can get along. And what that means is the community groups need to learn to speak with objects. And they were led out to the secret location, blindfold, where they would learn how you spoke with objects, which began as little rocks. Eventually, once the community groups, so we role-played the creation of these community groups. You had the high flyers, the execs, the kind of eco-warriors. Once they'd learned basic language, eventually they would be given permission to meet the outsiders for what was called the Great Conversation, which was going to be an improvisation with bigger objects. The objects were kind of like phrases, we sort of thought of them as. I'm going to jump forwards a little bit. So they're starting to get a bit bigger, and they're kind of in what seems a bit like the Ewok village, but the outsiders aren't there yet. So they were practicing, like, how would you say a phrase using these objects? Like, how would you state something about yourself? These were like the kind of gatekeepers. They were like just checking in to see how they were doing, and at some point when they thought people were ready, they would go and they would let them pass through the gates. Then some of the outsiders turned up, and they brought with them bigger phrases, you know, bigger words, more complex language. Eventually, everyone ended up on this platform underneath the motorway bridge where the conversation would happen. And this was a total improvisation. There was really almost no rules whatsoever other than say what you're going to try and say and see if it can be reciprocated, see if we can come to some kind of semblance of understanding. And it was odd because no one talked. You know, it was just quiet. It's Jack Wrigley, my old studio mate, who doesn't know what he's got himself in for, but he's found his purpose. My wife amazingly came to this, and if you know my wife, Boo, there she is. This is like her kryptonite. It's like her worst nightmare, to be like made to role play, but like with pastel objects where you can't talk and you've got. So she did it. I was amazed. Anyway, so we had this thing happen, and it felt kind of joyous. You know, it felt like something happened, and I don't still quite know what. Trying to keep a straight face. Well done, Boo. And then it ended, and we sat around and we talked about what happened. Like, what was the value of that? Let's go, present the view. Okay, so then we ran it again. I was like, okay, we did it in a wood. It was sort of nice. Everyone hugged each other and it felt lovely, and maybe the outsiders were integrated. So we ran it in the basement of a building called the Rose Lipman building in Hackney, in de Beauvoir. And altogether more like moody, basement, dark, industrial. One of the guys who was one of the characters had to pull out, but he came in at the last minute and he decided he wanted to play music for the event. He played this like droning, industrial, weird kind of organic soundtrack, and it just laid this like this really like moody tone. So when the community groups came in, at first it was like, oh, this is nice, they're kind of getting on, there's some exchanges going on here. And then perhaps because one of the costume designers who came, her son has ADHD, he came, he's like a teenager, he was just like, yeah, we can break stuff. Like, you know, this stuff isn't, and again, we hadn't said you couldn't, but like 10, 20 minutes later, everything had been like shattered and snapped and smashed and was in bits. And it wasn't meant to be done, you know, I hadn't made them with that purpose. So they were covered in like plaster dust, which was in the air, everyone was coughing, and people were really quite stressed as well. It was quite upsetting. And people left with handshaking, and we sat around, and but it sort of felt, it felt like it was the right way for it to go. But the same thing, I guess, I was kind of looking at, or was talking at, which was, how do these two groups who don't talk the same language meet one another? Okay. This is like a little bit of a clip from a LARP that I made with Nina, who I talked about earlier on. And it's called the Checkerboard Crew. Another type of LARP is like a pervasive LARP, which is where you use the city or outside space as your play space. So you use people that you encounter as players in your game without their consent, potentially. So we played a game at night, and the story was that the people played time travelers, and they'd come from the future. It was a commission by Stoke City. They wanted to look at regenerating brownfield sites. So I came up with this idea that these time travelers would make temporary sculptures out of the things they found on this site, and these sculptures would act as kind of like signs or signifiers about the way we should take the direction of the city. And they might kind of have some semblance of architecture. It was played at midnight, Part of the reason it was played at midnight was so that I could be there filming it and it didn't feel like it was too intrusive, so it was filmed with night vision cameras. And the people taking part were just a bunch of people that lived in Stoke that replied to an advert saying, do you want to come and take part in a weird LARP? And no one knew what LARP was. And it was 4 hours long. We started at midnight, we finished at 4 in the morning. And the next day we went back and visited and filmed some of the traces of their presence. So what emerged though were these strange kind of rituals in relation to objects. These kind of dances came out of it. This is of course the traffic cone dance. Oh, it's not a dance, but... And they couldn't talk. Everything was done with hand signals. So they developed a language beforehand in the workshops. So they had like 5 or 6 key phrases that they could talk about in game. And then that was shown in the gallery along with a sort of map of where, here we go. Is that gonna, where these things were, you know, the traces of this. Something that I used in the work that I did here at the Serpentine, and I was using then, was hobo signage. I don't know if anyone knows anything about that. It's a kind of form of like hieroglyphics, I guess you could say, that's used by hobos in America to kind of tell other people places that you might get a drink, or you could sleep, or you could have sex, or score drugs, or be safe for the night. And we use these symbols as the basis for the characters in this. So rather than there being like a kind of written bit of text that someone had to learn and create a character, the characters were all based on a kind of squiggle. And it was about how those squiggles might inform movement. Okay. I wonder whether I should, how am I doing for time? Let's have a look. It would have been very handy if I'd started my stopwatch, wouldn't it? At the beginning, Adam. I'll just show a teeny other clip. I'm sorry I keep jumping in and out. It's very annoying, I know. Where are we? Tate Workshop. I was really fortunate to get this amazing job at Tate a couple of years ago where I was on residency for a year. It's like the dream job. You know, you're paid, you're in the gallery, you're running workshops with children. And I decided I wanted to use that time to try and develop 90-minute LARPs with audiences in a gallery. And the premise of these kind of LARPs was that it would be about artworks meeting one another. How do we embody an artwork? In order to know it better, how do we become a voice? And how do we become a voice as a group? And then how does a voice sort of creature meet like a Rachel Whiteread creature? And we played that over a year and it evolved and it went on to become quite a complex kind of game. So I'll just show you a bit of that. Okay, yeah, this one's a nice one. This is when I was really skinny and seemed to only eat soup and ride my bike every day. I've moved to Margate and piled on the pounds to middle-aged spread.
And there's a lot of mix of looseness and then more kind of geometric stuff. And it might just be like the grids they might use as a kind of score to like become...
And I don't normally do that. In the morning, this was the day after my friend's wedding. You can imagine how I was feeling in the morning. And they said, yeah, if you can just do some sort of performance-y stuff in front of the paintings. I said, don't normally do that. I went, nah, no, look great. I was so hungover. It was unbelievable. And then with children. It's like, who were great, you know. So we would go around the gallery and the question that I would ask the children would be, find an artwork that's most like you and then say why. And that was, it was such an sort of enlightening question. All these amazing things would come out and there was no right or wrong answer. So we would find all these different artworks that people felt were them and then they would sort of cluster them into communities of similar things and then they might choose one that felt like it was the epitome or the embodiment of this group and then we would work out how we made that come to life as a creature.
Can you please tell everybody here why this artwork is most like you?
I'll jump forwards a little bit. Oh dear. It ended up with us in the turbine hall. making these kind of human creature sculptures that would meet each other. And I play this with children, I play this with adults, old people or whatever, and it works wherever we are. People don't seem to care if anyone's watching. And it leads to a really interesting conversation about difference and how we resolve difference between two things, or what things are in common, or what bridges could we build for these two things to agree on, which was often the question. It'd be like, how do we get the Beuys sculpture to see eye to eye with the Picasso? And lots of interesting things would come out of that. Out of that came this kind of process of me retrospectively kind of scoring the workshops as a kind of way to think about it, or maybe make like an instructional for a subsequent staging of it. It also sort of scratched an itch for me. I studied printmaking. I didn't do any performance and study, and I liked screen printing. So I felt like I'd found a way to kind of liberate myself and be able to make drawings that in some way talked about a live event and had a kind of logic. There's a kind of, so I like the idea of maybe of using these in the future at some point and trying to make them back into live things. I don't know whether that's even remotely legible. That is like the instructions from the thing that we developed at Tate. It became a very short script. Should you be interested, it's on my website. You can download it and use it. It takes an hour and a half. It's very straightforward. I've been running that in loads of different places. We ran it as part of the John Raffman exhibition at 176. They asked me to make a sort of LARP that could play in the university he created. So people became artworks from the show and then met one another. We played it at the Turner Contemporary with this blank canvas group. I played it in the V&A, so people became statues in the V&A or artworks and met one another. Recently been playing on the beach in Margate, which has been wicked fun. Sandy cracks all around. That was really good fun though. I'm very serious about being silly, like I'm making light, but now this is Hamish, the wonderful Hamish I mentioned earlier on. This was us shortly after we took part in Tino Segal's These Associations at Tate, which is where we met each other. We were involved in this amazing performance for months. And on the very last day, we realised that we both liked LARP and we were into dressing up, and we decided to make some stuff together. Hamish and I have been on a bit of a journey together to Knutpunkt and all these other LARPs. And we've got to the point where we started thinking, he'd taken part in some of my performances beforehand, and we thought, can we make performances where there's no talking at all, but not just in the play, but also in the delivery of the play? What if there's no written instructions at all? Can it be the case that someone comes in and the objects and the sculptures and things that are in the space have an implicit rule or give you an implicit alibi to behave in a certain way? So we did a series of small workshops at first where we tried to sort of unlearn objects and make you kind of do different things with them. And then we set up this game where we filled a room full of stuff and we invited people in. There was no rules whatsoever. We didn't tell them what was going to happen. We just said, you can't talk. And we played this weird, spooky music in the background. After about 45 minutes, people were annoyed and awkward and confused, and we led them out again. Then we brought them back in again, and we said, aha, this time we're going to give you a choice of an object that you can wear. And people had made a very clear decision, and they became a character that was based on this object, and they took on these roles which were kind of carers for one another, or people that wanted to some way destroy the story that was being made. There's those kind of polemic roles. We had a debrief, and rather than write what happened, we tried to describe what happened in drawing. This was one of the players who happened to be an Alexander technique teacher, who thought she saw a lot of parallels between what we were doing and some of the methodology in Alexander technique. Got invited to do something similar at Tate. Me and Hamish developed the idea of objects being the kind of catalyst for you being something else. And we created all these foam objects, there's me. We made this lovely kind of foam blanket, which became a sort of creche space. And this was at a family festival. So to give you an idea, like the thing we'd done prior to was in a closed room, 20 people, 2 hours. Tate Britain, Devines, 6,000 children, like no sign up, just come in, do what you like over a weekend. And it was carnage. And, but something amazing kind of happened and came out of it. What we asked people to do is we asked them to take an object and be a carer of it. We liked the idea of people being a bit like leafcutter ants, marching along with those bright coloured leaves. So we said, you can go off into the gallery, did this without talking, it was all like, and we said, we would like you to use the object as a bridge between you and an artwork to tell a story. document that story in some way, and this sculpture is going to kind of be the tool for you to do that. Document it on Polaroid camera, bring it back and attach it to this reflective sculpture we did. And that happened. And people also just slept on the sculptures, which was nice. Okay, I'm conscious that we're getting nearly there. Okay, so this, I like the idea of making works where I'm not present, like setting up a situation. And this was a provocation that Tate asked me to do for teachers, which I still don't know the results of it, but it ran for a year. They gave it to a teacher and they did this. I'm at some point hopefully going to find out. But I like, this excites me. I like this idea of making a script for something and then just sending it off in a way and seeing what might come out of that. Now, we come to something quite recent. This was one of the, me trying to think through what we were doing here at the Serpentine, this Moving Up project. I was like a kid in the candy shop. I had an amazing budget and I could have loads of amazing cameras. I probably went a bit nuts on cameras. We had cameras on the ceiling and wearable chest cameras and a Steadicam and all the rest of it. And the idea with the project though was to look at the difficulty primary school children have in transitioning from primary school to secondary school and the anxiety that's felt by them. And was there a way that we could sort of help them, give them some tools through role play? And I used some of the creature thing that you saw before, that idea of becoming cultures or communities and then meeting one another and then seeing how they might get on. And that led to some really wonderful conversations about, well, the realization that actually it's not that scary, or that you could go and meet other people and you could find lots of things in common with people that otherwise you might be afraid to meet. And this summer, so last summer, sorry, we brought that here and we sort of ran like a distilled version of this. Was it 3 days that we were in the theatre? 4, yeah. So we sort of distilled this like 4-day workshop, which was in blocks of sort of a few hours. We distilled it into like a 90-minute workshop, which we ran out here on the hottest week imaginable. We all were like pink like lobsters. And we tried to kind of condense it down into this 90-minute session where the children would start by trying to kind of find a relationship between themselves and a hobo symbol. They weren't all hobo symbols, but some of them were. The children didn't know that they were hobo symbols and we're still not 100% certain about whether that's the right thing or not, because some of them have some kind of slightly dark meaning perhaps, but it wasn't so much what they meant, it was what they thought they might meant or how they could see themselves in the symbol. And we tried to get them to relate to one another, find commonalities, and start to kind of create a community. And that meant creating a flag, which in some way distilled an element of their group. Then we mapped out a kind of sort of community spaces on the grass, places that these communities felt were special to them, that they lived in, or they might want to invite other people to. And that involved a really good, actually a really nice part of the whole thing was asking the children what rules they thought they would need to make the play fair. And generally, like, the boys would be like, stealing's cool! And because we brought materials out and it was kind of a bit of a free rein, it could be. And then everyone would agree that no, we're going to have a no stealing rule. And some of the boys would be like a bit disappointed about it. It wasn't always boys, I'm being terrible to say that it's boy girl. But anyway, they would set up some rules about how they were going to play. And the play period was a sort of 10-minute period where they would try to construct something that represented their temporary community. It was very open to what it was that they constructed. Invariably, what would happen is they would want to use materials that they were short of from other groups, and that would mean they would need to set up places of exchange or kind of bartering mechanisms, and that would also mean that the map that they'd made, it might include tunnels and doors and secret entrances or kind of safe spaces. And it was great. So I've moved to Margate, as I say. This is like dream amazing. If you know anything about Margate, you know it's like UKIP council. So I got involved with this project with Turner Contemporary called Art Inspiring Change, which was an 18-month project in which 4 schools, 4 artists the schools were going to kind of change part of Margate, and the artists were picked by the children, so that in itself was very weird. And they were my boss. I would turn up every week for a year and a half, and I would help them make an artwork. And they chose a wood, this rundown wood. And part of the process was we used LARP, a sort of LARP process, to role play UKIP Council and the pitching of the artwork to the council. So what you can see is the disgruntled UKIP council members like not being pleased with the suggestion that the kids have come up with for their public artwork. And we ran that, and we had another group of children watching and sort of silently judging, and they would rotate. They would get to be council members or artists or the silent watchers. And then we went to the council and we pitched it to UKIP, to the council in Margate, in the council chambers. It was amazing. And they loved it, and they granted us permission. Of course, it was kind of going to happen, but the kids were like, 10 foot tall, and they got to speak on these tannoy systems, and they got to talk about their wonderful ideas. And then we took a wood, we cleaned it out, and we installed this wonderful laser cut perspex shapes up trees, which they'd made with this budget we had, as a temporary artwork. And it was cool. And now I can't leave my house in Margate because it's tiny without just being attacked by an army of children who are it's cool. I love them. They're really great kids. So coming kind of towards the end-ish, this is the sort of penultimate, that is the proceeding before the project I'm going to end on. I was invited to take part in a small biennale in the Dolomites called SMACH, or SMAC, S-M-A-C-H, where they speak Ladinese. I didn't even know that language existed until I went to the Dolomites. I proposed to make a series of sort of sculpture repositories on the mountain tops, and the invitation would be that people could gain shelter from the wind and rain if they wanted, or they could go and take these sculptures and they would take them home, and there'd be an invitation by me to use the object to instigate a type of exchange between you and someone else. And it could just be having a candlelit dinner with your neighbour, or it could be having a car boot sale and the object was there present. It could be whatever you wanted. I had to rein it in a little bit because it was up in the mountains and everything kept blowing off, and deers kept potentially going to eat the foam, and I was going to be responsible for laying waste to wildlife with my foam objects blowing down mountaintops. So we brought it back to the museum itself, and we had this sort of library of these objects here. And on the opening night of the private view, we populated this 450-year-old beautiful house, Casa de Maya, and we had a private view. People turned up in lederhosens, which is what they wear there, and we used the objects to tell a story. Again, it was a sort of unspoken story. The project didn't really go as I wanted it to. Not many people took the objects home. Lots of things that I thought happened just didn't happen. A few people did, but it didn't really go exactly as I planned. The private view was great and had this lovely performance, but it didn't work out exactly right. Move to the present. I've got a show coming up in end of April at Space Gallery with Priscilla here, who's invited me. And I'm going to sort of take that idea and expand that, the thing that sort of didn't work in the Dolomites, and try running it in Hackney. And the idea is that to try and treat the gallery space as a kind of place for exchange between different groups, and to try to send out objects kind of into the environment, the neighbourhood, and to have more of a kind of concrete idea about how you might use those in a process of exchange. So what's underpinning this still is an interest in trying to bring people together, or thoughts together, or groups or forces together. And the object is kind of the instigator of that. So it's kind of like I'm seeing them as me in object form. So rather than me get people to do it, the kind of object tacitly invites people to do that. So it's going to be a bit like an adult play centre, perhaps, maybe. These are some doodles of it. And some of the things that I'm looking at the moment in terms of the objects is them relating to the body and hands and things to do with touch and exchange or generosity or sensitivity on one hand, and then also objects that relate more to kind of anti-human forms of design, like tramp spikes or landmines or tank traps. And so there's kind of going to be like almost two armies of different objects, some which are designed or have the thinking with these are to bring people together, and then some which are kind of about keeping people apart. And they're going to be loanable. Hopefully, I will get some back, and hopefully they will stand the test of time, and hopefully people will want to take them away. It feels like a bit of a risky experiment, but that's kind of why it's exciting for me. And something I'm wrestling with, and I still haven't quite worked out, is I really want to find a way to like capture moments from these short LARPs that I make and kind of give them some form. And so I'm looking at making these little kind of maquettes or models which have got, this is not, but they've got aspects of body parts potentially in them. And they're about trying to kind of find a balance between two groups. So I'm sort of seeing these as being two groups of people in a way that are trying to kind of work together to achieve some outcome. Okay, and there's me in a pink dress. In where am I? Somewhere in London, I can't remember exactly where. That is kind of me coming to the end. I wanted to just end with like a couple of, these are questions that I don't have the answer to necessarily, and these are things that I'm sort of looking at a bit in my research. And anyone who's done a PhD or is doing a PhD knows that like you set out to do one thing and then you're constantly changing your idea about what it is that actually you're trying to ask. But yeah, can LARPs or similar things be documented? Like, should we document them? Like, who's that for? Or why? And can like the film of these things do the same job that the thing itself did? I always think that about any sort of participatory work or relational work. Like, how do you document these things? Do you need to? And I ask that because I want to make films. I'm interested in filming these things. Should they be two separate things? I don't know. Who owns these works? Is it, if it's authored by a group of people collectively, like, is it fair for me to put my name on it if I film it? I don't know. They're not being paid, they're not performers. They might even pay me to come and take part. What other things? And those are questions I've sort of touched on, like what's the role of the host? I think this is a thing that I've become very aware of myself as being like the host. I sometimes feel like a children's TV presenter, as I'm always like, hey guys, we're going to do this thing. And I like that, but I want to now take part in some of my own things and have someone else do that and see what that's like. So anyway. And then like, is a performance for 10 people where there's no audience fine? You know, is that okay? Does it have to have documentation? Does it have to be public? How do these things work in a public art context? And we're going to stop there. Thanks very much.